Isn't it your experience that with the proliferation of technology, that we hear many voices that we've never heard before? As a matter of fact, I read today that, we call it AI, artificial intelligence, that we all use to one extent or another when we say, "Hey Siri, call so-and-so." But someone said today that artificial intelligence can even duplicate the voices of people we know so that we don't. Someone said, I didn't know to whom I was speaking, the real person or the artificial intelligence voice. So we hear many, many voices in our world today that heretofore we just didn't hear, they weren't available. And we heard in the gospel today, Jesus say, the sheep, hear my voice. Father James Martin, the Jesuit, tells the story of his Jesuit formation some 40 years ago. And he spent 2 years in Kenya as part of the Jesuit refugee services. And they helped refugees from all over East Africa who had settled into Nairobi to start self-supporting businesses. And Father Martin was a graduate of the Wharton School of Business from Penn State University and was formerly a GE person before he discerned for the priesthood. So what a great mentor they had. And many of these businesses were handicraft kind of businesses, patchwork quilts, making batiks. One man was an Ethiopian. He painted icons. And in time, Father Martin said they opened a shop to market these handcrafted goods, and the shop was called the Mikono Center, after the Swahili word for hands. The Mikono Center. And believe it or not, Father Martin says, they're still in business after some 40 years, so I guess he did a good job. And outside the shop was a little lawn. And one day, he said, one of the Kenyan women came into my office all excited and said, "Kuna kundu," which means in Swahili, he thought it means there are sheep. He thought his Swahili was pretty good, but he understood what she said. He said, I looked out and there, sure enough, was a herd of sheep. And there was a small, or a flock of sheep, we should say, grazing on the lawn. And standing by was a boy who was wearing his red plaid cloth. And in this culture, the youngest individuals tended the sheep. And when they got a little older, they tended the goats. And then as they became men, they tended the cattle. And Father Martin said, the sheep didn't bother me out on that lawn. He said, so I waved to the shepherd, and he waved back. And he said, I went back about an hour later, and again I looked at them, and the sheep were still there, and I waved to the boy. And then a few seconds later, the boy called to the sheep. Kuai was the word he used, which means come, come. And Father Martin said, to my great surprise, they all looked up at him instantly, in a heartbeat, and they started to follow him. And he said, I marveled at that, because there were plenty of other voices. There was a lot of noise around, many other voices of people. There was traffic. And even through that, they heard the voice of this shepherd boy. And Father Martin realized suddenly that this was the story of today's gospel. The sheep knew his voice. How so? How did the sheep know his voice? In the same way that we know the shepherd's voice. To begin with, they spent time with the shepherd, as we are called to do, so that the Lord is not a stranger. And in our own lives, we can spend time with the shepherd, Jesus the Christ, in the Gospels, in the sacraments, and in service to others. And in these places, we come to know his voice. We hear his voice. If only we'll listen. And that's hard for us. At least it is for me. I'm always figuring out what I'm going to say next, instead of just deeply listening. Now, we can hear Jesus' voice in the Gospels when we hear him constantly speak of love, mercy, forgiveness, and compassion. And we hear his voice in the sacraments, where he invites us to participate in his life through the life of the church. You know, today is Vocation Sunday, and it's not only vocations to the priesthood, the diaconate, and the vowed religious life, right, sister? But it's also vocations of the laity to serve God's people through the church. That's why we hear the shepherd's voice. We hear the shepherd's voice in service to others, asking us, please help the least of my sisters and brothers. And we meet the Lord and hear his voice, especially in prayer, because God's voice has a recognizable quality. It's a quality of peacefulness, it's uplifting, and it's comforting. And in our consciences, God's voice can encourage us to do the right thing. When you really discern, we're trying to make a decision and we're trying to discern God's voice. Did you hear his voice in the depths of your conscience? Where in some fashion the Lord said, go on, it's okay, you're on the right path. You're on the right path. But if we're being warned about doing something bad, on the other hand, that same voice, the voice in our conscience, can be persistent and loud. And you know what? You kind of feel it here, don't you? You kind of feel it here, where that voice says, come on, what are you doing? And over time, through our consciences, we get to know that voice. We can distinguish the voice. We get to know what God's voice sounds like. And we also get to know voices that don't come from God. And boy, are they out there today. God's voice is not the voice that makes us fear. There's nothing in the scriptures in the New Testament where Jesus says, you better be afraid. No, he said, don't be afraid. I did a funeral the other day, and at the end of the committal service over at Memory Garden, a woman stopped me and said, you know, can I talk to you? She said, my brother is dying, and I don't know what to tell him. He's really afraid. And I said, I think we just go back to the words of Jesus. Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. I am with you. So our goal in life is to know the voice of the shepherd, to be attentive to it, and to respond to it without delay, just as those sheep did to that boy shepherd when they heard his voice. Whammo, they were there. There are many voices in our world today. So maybe this week, I thought about this, and I prayed about this, and I thought maybe what I'm going to try to do this week is every morning say to myself, whose voice am I going to listen to today? The voice of Jesus, deep within, in the Gospels, in the sacrament, and in service to others? Or am I going to allow myself to be deluged by all the voices that are out there of hate, division, and all the other vices in our world? Whose voice will we listen to?